Welcome to our program. My name is Greg Cope, and I'm a partner in the Real Estate Capital Markets and Mergers and Acquisition Practice Group. To the best of our ability, we would like for this to be an informal discussion. I'm happy to introduce Lawrence Elbaum and Patrick Gadsden, who are co-heads of the V&E Shareholder Activism Practice. Our shareholder activism practice has handled well over 200 activism campaigns over the last 7 proxy seasons, and routinely ranks as one of the top ranked and most active shareholder activism defense practice in the country. I appreciate you guys joining us for the program, lending us your expertise here. During this presentation, we're going to go over a general overview of the shareholder activism landscape. Also give you an introduction to what shareholder activism is and what it means and how it typically plays out. We're going to drill down and give some specifics about the activism in the REIT sector, as well as talk about some advanced preparation considerations and how the universal proxy, which is going to go into effect for the first time this year, how it could interface with activism campaigns. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Lawrence to talk about the introduction to shareholder activism.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Just so folks know, we're going to actually advertise the cuisine we're going to have for our in-person event the next time. There's about 35 pounds of barbecue here that guests are enjoying, but we'll broadcast it next time because we want to see people in person. We enjoy seeing folks face to face these days as well. But thank you for the time today. So there are different types of activism when we talk about shareholder activism campaigns in the United States. We'll start over in the bottom right box here, because when we're talking about modern shareholder activism, you hear a lot about social causes, you hear a lot about governance causes, but in our world, contests for corporate control, the investor that's bringing a campaign must first identify an economic thesis, and that thesis is usually phrased as unlocking value for the investor and for other shareholders. There are other ways that it's put, such as sell the company quickly, or sell the company through an orderly process, or a dividend, or a share repurchase, or some other type of M&A or joint venture. But usually there has to be an unlock value economic thesis. And then the activists, once they've identified a way to actually make money on a prospective investment, then you'll see the activists start to layer in themes about corporate governance. Is the board staggered or annually elected? Are there director tenure and age limits? Do the board committees have refreshed leadership? Are the chairman and CEO roles of the company with one person, or are they separate individuals? If it's the same person, is there a lead independent director? So on and so forth. You'll start hearing about governance activism and also about social causes, particularly the environment. The most recent proxy seasons, those will become part of the campaign. Why? Because the voters in shareholder activism campaigns who are shareholders, they like to hear about governance and social issues as they decide how to cast their ballot. But of course, at the end of the day, recall that if there is no economic thesis, modern shareholder activists, modern activist hedge funds are not going to simply bring a campaign based on governance and social issues. We've already called this a battle for corporate control. Many years ago, in the 70s and particularly in the 80s, early 90s, there really weren't very many proxy fights every single year for board seats. Those were the age of the Raiders, where hostile bidders would try to blitz companies, take them over overnight. There was an absence of regulation or very, very early regulatory regime during that time. And they were able to achieve those objectives pretty readily. Now, the battle for control typically takes place at the board level. And it's not usually with a hostile bidder trying to get control through a leveraged buyout or a tender offer. What we're looking at now are investors taking smaller stakes in companies. They're actually not even making control investments, but they're trying to get control over the company and its assets by trying to replace either a majority of the board or the power center of the board if they're going for less than a majority of the board. At the end of the day, these are very much like political elections. Companies have annual meetings every single year. In fact, most companies are incorporated in Delaware. Delaware corporations have to have meetings every 13 months to elect directors. There are other mechanisms to try to remove and replace directors. There could be actions by written consent. There could be special meetings, but usually these take place at the annual meeting level, and they take place, if they're going to happen, usually around the summertime before folks go on vacation. And an investor, if they think there's value to be unlocked, will try to put their own directors on a board to replace existing directors to try to pursue the agenda to unlock value, whatever that unlock value thesis is. Next slide, please. This is just an aesthetically pleasing comic about what I just described, the difference in branding between the 80s and what's happened over the last 20 years or so with modern shareholder activism. Patrick, you want to talk about these mugshots?
Sure. So we call this our headshot slide. Full context in the personal disclosure, prior to joining V&E, I represented nothing but activists. So many of the guys, and they're almost always guys in our space, in this headshot slide are former clients. Some of them are okay guys, others not so much if you interact with them. But if you see any of these sort of more celebrity activists in your stock, you need to sit up straight and pay attention, because these are the folks who probably have the most capital in this space to put to work. Certainly wouldn't mind spending upwards of 20 to 25 million on a proxy fight. So if you see any of these actors, know that it's very serious. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. These are more of my former clients, probably a third or more of my former clients. These are, lists of hedge funds that are particularly active in our space. This list is not all inclusive. It changes. There are more and more actors in this space every year. And as you can see, even with this sort of small universe of players, there are quite a few hedge fund actors and investors in the shareholder activism space. Go to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about campaign themes. Generally speaking, there are only a few buckets of hedge fund side shareholder activism in terms of what we see on an economic basis. So you have your M&A activism, and empirically speaking, the majority of shareholder activists, if you look at their returns, they really do mimic or are very highly correlated with M&A ARB funds. Many of the folks are just basically M&A ARB shops in corporate governance clothing. The first thesis for the majority of the first timers and the second timers in our space is almost always sell the company or do something drastic in terms of breaking up the company, because there are only a few ways to make money as a shareholder activist in the space. And that's almost all primarily in the stock price appreciation, whether it be because the intrinsic value of the company is more readily reflected, or whether it be because a premium was paid and you get taken out. Those are really the best ways to sort of monetize a shareholder activism campaign. And shareholder activists are not in the business of getting board seats. They're in the business of making money, and their LPs really don't care how many board seats they get. They care about the returns. So M&A arbitrage, sell the company, that's the majority of shareholder activism. You do have some balance sheet activism, which is our second bucket. It's really a shareholder return capital allocation bucket. Now that you're having increased interest rate creep and additional potential taxation of share repurchases, we'll see how that affects shareholder activists in the REIT space theses in terms of asking for share repurchases, special dividend occasionally, but more frequently what you're seeing are shareholder activists in the REIT space concerned about the actual dividend and the actual coverage of the dividend with free cash flow, AFFO. Operational, very rarely do you see a shareholder activist who has real operational background experience. The majority of them are quant jocks, quote unquote, right? They're spreadsheet summarized. That's kind of how they make their bones. They aren't, folks who came from, operating any public companies or private companies. Even in the REIT space, the majority of the shareholder activists have investment banking backgrounds or real estate investment backgrounds in the public space. The majority of them don't have sort of private expertise, even in management in the real estate space. It's pretty unusual to see any shareholder activist that has that operational experience and expertise. You do see it occasionally, but for the most part, it's very rare. When you do see it in the REIT space, the only thesis brought by these folks is, internal to external management or external internal management. That's kind of how they qualify their entire operational theses. You're not dealing with folks with a great deal of experience. In terms of corporate governance, Lawrence touched upon this earlier. In my experience, even representing a lot of these folks, corporate governance is seen more as break glass. So if things go wrong, then there are tremendous corporate governance concerns. But until that happens, governance, right? There isn't as high of a degree of sensitivity until there has been stock price depreciation or some sort of other operational problem. When you do see corporate governance concerns overlaid on a campaign, you're now seeing it much more early than you used to. A lot of that has happened in the wake of Exxon's fight, where the proxy advisors made it very clear that if you want to have a serious conversation about governance, you better bring it up early to management, and it better be pretty transparent for shareholders so no one can accuse you of sort of having this bolt-on last-minute glazing over of corporate governance that you really may not authentically care about. In terms of changes of corporate governance mechanics or substance after a campaign has started, it's very rare that a company will be given the benefit of the doubt in terms of why they made those changes. If an activist shows up and he goes public, in all likelihood, any changes that the company makes in terms of corporate governance, whether it be declassifying the board, giving shareholders a lower threshold of bringing special meetings or acting written consent, whatever the case may be, the proxy advisors and institutions pretty much in unison allocate all of the praise for those changes to the hedge fund actor that surfaced with the campaign prior to those changes being announced. So if you are considering to make any corporate governance changes, it behooves you to do so early before any player pops up publicly and asks for those changes, because even if you had them contemplated and we're working on them behind the scenes, you're going to find it's pretty tough to have institutional shareholders or the proxy advisors believe you if you actually see yourselves in a fight. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. So, all right.
Now I'm going to put my microphone on.
Go ahead.
I'm happy to repeat the first 12 slides if anyone's having trouble sleeping later. So this slide's pretty self-explanatory, but you could see pretty clearly that modern shareholder activism campaigns continue to rise year over year. seems to be pretty much recession proof. I don't know if anyone's ever referred to activism as completely recession proof, but I think you see a few economic cycles in here because you have the 08-09 financial crisis, and then you have the COVID crisis just a few years ago. And it seems to us that where there are public companies and public company investors, there's always going to be some thesis to unlock value somewhere, and therefore there will be shareholder activists and campaigns. But the interesting thing is about this graph is what's not on here. But let me just talk a little bit about what is on here. The number of campaigns that you see for this year, the blue bar, which is closing in on 400 campaigns, be the first time ever we hit that benchmark. Those are campaigns that become public based upon an activist publicizing or a company publicizing an activist's campaign. What the red bar shows are campaigns that actually become proxy fights. And a campaign becomes a proxy fight when formal nominations are received from the shareholder activist to try to put directors on the board or to try to advance a particular business proposition. So you could see, obviously, a lot of these matters get resolved before they become proxy fights. But what is not on here are the 100 or so campaigns, at least 100 or so campaigns that are not public, that therefore do not become nominations, and never see the light of day and get resolved before they go public. Our practice probably is defending somewhere between 35 to 45 public campaigns in any given proxy season. But there are probably another 15 to 20 non-public campaigns, ranging from a really tough series of phone calls with a shareholder or a number of private letters from a shareholder demanding certain changes that never see the light of day, that get resolved outside of the public eye. I think if you added all of these together, we'd be in excess of 500 campaigns a year, which is, I think, well more than 10% of public company corporate America. The next two slides show ISS and Glass Lewis recommendations. And just very quickly, ISS and Glass Lewis are proxy advisory firms. They provide recommendations to their customers who are typically the largest shareholders and the hedge fund shareholders in public companies in the United States and around the world. These shareholders don't usually have the time to read every single proxy statement and to make a fully informed decision on how to vote on the proposals for every proxy statement for every public company annual meeting that's in their portfolio. So ISS and Glass Lewis play a role in helping to make the information digesting process for shareholders much more efficient, and they give shareholders a basis to rely on independent assessments of how companies' proposals for directors and other proposals should be voted on. There are folks that say ISS and Glass Lewis have a lot of direct influence over how shareholders vote in corporate America. They certainly have a lot of indirect influence. I don't think there's an argument about that. We can argue about how direct it is. And what's interesting about the stats on these two slides, and you could show the next slide too, while ISS and Glass Lewis recommendations for boards or for activists, it does yo-yo a bit year in, year out, but the sample sizes are really small. We just showed a slide that shows there are hundreds of campaigns. There's even 75 proxy fights, but out of those 75 proxy fights, only a small proportion of those actually go to ISS and Glass Lewis for recommendations because they get resolved. So we tell our clients, don't be fooled by and don't necessarily be guided by this data. Just assume you're not going to get an ISS and Glass Lewis recommendation, and build your campaign around that so that you start developing those narratives as early as possible. Going to slide 15. Thank you. Most proxy fights, as we just mentioned, don't go all the way to a vote. They don't even make it to ISS and Glass Lewis meetings. And sometimes they just settle right after ISS and Glass Lewis meetings. Why? Well, if the company's winning, oftentimes the activist may just pack up their bags and go home and withdraw. But on the flip side, if the activist is winning, Patrick and I will sometimes, or oftentimes rather, get a phone call from the activist's counsel saying, we should talk about a settlement. And you'd think that the activist would try to take a victory lap because they've maybe won ISS and Glass Lewis recommendations, and they've been pelting the company very hard for quite some time. You think they take a victory lap, but not so. We get that phone call. There are a number of reasons why. I think number one, the activists realize that they're going to be joining the boardroom, and most of these campaigns are not for control over the board. They're for replacing 1 to 3 or 4 directors, a minority of the board. The activist realizes that they and their nominees to the board need to start mending fences. These campaigns can be very nasty. So it's an opportunity to do that. Another reason is if an activist is not getting control over the board, they're getting a minority representation on the board, and they win it at the annual meeting, they're not going to get board committees. They're not going to get a new committee. If they want a new committee to do something, they're not going to get leadership roles on the board. And that could make it harder for them to accomplish their thesis once they're inside the boardroom. And the last reason that we hear about this is because activists want to get expense reimbursement. They know that if the company gives them a few concessions and is saved a possible embarrassment of a loss at the ballot box, they know that the company may be somewhat generous with expense reimbursement. These campaigns are very expensive for activists. As a proportion of the assets that the activists are managing versus the permanent capital that the company has, or almost permanent capital the company has, the expense reimbursement can be very meaningful for the activist. Companies that are well prepared are working with their D&O insurance carriers to try to get reimbursements covered. But what does the company get in return for making these concessions that I just mentioned in order to avoid a defeat of the ballot box? They get what's called a peace treaty or a standstill, where the activist agrees for a period of time not to run a proxy fight, not to publicly and privately disparage the company, or not to publicly or privately campaign against the company for a period of time. In other words, giving the company runway. Patrick, one thing that's, I guess, come up in the past few slides that might be worth touching upon, which is really your specific expertise, is ISS and Glass Lewis, and the standard they use for deciding whether to give a minority to an investor. Do you have like a minute or two on that?
Yeah. So if you do find yourself in a proxy fight with a shareholder activist, and it does go long enough that you do receive an ISS and or Glass Lewis recommendation, which, depending on what your shareholder base profile looks like, could be very influential. If your shareholder base is very heavy in terms of institutions, then ISS and Glass Lewis's recommendations are going to be pretty mission critical. If you have a very heavy retail base, then maybe ISS and Glass Lewis might not carry as much weight. Many retail investors don't really even know the function of ISS and or Glass Lewis. Many retail investors don't really even vote all that frequently. So depending on your shareholder base, the impact of ISS and Glass Lewis's recommendations will be pretty heavily weighted. That being said, ISS Glass Lewis, they do have tests to determine how they recommend in proxy campaigns. Now, when thinking about these tests, it's important to remember that we aren't talking about your traditional uncontested election ISS and Glass Lewis proxy recommendation people. We're talking about a separate, super group of very dedicated and totally focused folks at each respective institution that only focuses on contested situations. And these are folks who, although they don't know your industry specifically, they are generalists, but really highly qualified. Folks with CFAs, JDs, investment banking backgrounds, name brand consulting backgrounds, really, really smart people who only focus on contested situations. Their tests are two-pronged for the most part. The first prong is there a case for change? Now, that's based on operations. It isn't so much based on governance, although governance is an aspect and variable that is considered. It's based on your TSR, CAGR, median analysis in terms of your performance relative to your peers. And the peers is a whole different conversation because these aren't your proxy compensation peers. These are your industry competitors. And ISS uses a peer set based on what you say, you being the issuer, say are your peers, and what the activists, on the other hand, says are your peers. And ISS will sometimes blend those and assess how you've performed relative to that peer group, that blended peer group. But it's based on how you've performed. Assuming that ISS and Glass Lewis both say based on TSR, the CAGR analysis, median analysis, all of the other financial and operational metrics that they use to determine whether or not a case for change has been made. They say, okay, there's been a case for change that's been made. The next step in their evaluation is which respective side has the group of candidates that are eligible for election who are in the best position to affect that change. Now, if you get past prong one of a case for change being made, there's probably an 85% chance that you also get a recommendation based on the second prong being that you have a superior slate or composition of nominees to affect that change. But sometimes it's not the case. But the analysis of whether or not your people are in the best place to affect the change, whether they be the activist people or the company's people, skill sets, experience. ISS and Glass Lewis are looking to what are the holes in operations or governance that need to be filled? Which respective candidates have the skill sets and experience to help fill those holes? If you are just seeing a hedge fund nominate folks from its fund and say, okay, these are the proper people, in all likelihood, ISS and Glass Lewis are not going to recommend those folks to be in the best position to affect the change because there's a very limited experience base there. But assuming that the company has a deeper bench of credible, highly experienced, focused people who have the requisite experience to fill the gaps that are needed on the board, you're in a good position. Now, there is some universal proxy stuff around these edges because now it's no longer who has the best slate, but who has the better candidates, each individual candidate. But even with that, it's about who are the people who have the experience that are best in position to fill the gaps of skill set needed on the board. So that's ISS, Glass Lewis 101, very high level, not granular, although I do read all the reports and can give a more granular set of talking points for those who need it. But that's the high level. In terms of the sorts of market cap sizes of targets that activists are targeting, market cap agnostic, industry agnostic, there has been a sort of heavily weighted proportion of activism campaigns in the large cap or mega cap space, but that can vary year to year. It's more about how much how many what's your AUM, right? So it's more about what is the size of the hedge fund. Smaller hedge funds go after smaller targets usually because they aren't able to have the capital to buy 5% or more of a company, and that's seen as sort of the benchmark of having ownership fully aligned with the rest of the shareholder base. So those smaller hedge funds that have less capital go after smaller issuer targets for which they can actually afford to buy 5% or more of the company. The bigger players, the more sophisticated activists, your Elliots, your Starboards, they're the ones that go after the larger companies, right? Why? Because they have the brand expertise and the capital to be seen as real legitimate voices of shareholders in those large mega cap and large cap companies. So really, it doesn't matter the size of your company. There is a matching hedge fund out there that could pursue you. So no one's safe, whether it even be nano cap. We've seen activism in the nano cap space or the mega cap space.
That description of different types of activism in the market, we'll now dig into some more recent trends in the REIT space. So the last few years have created an environment that's been conducive to activism campaigns. For example, this year, the real estate and REIT sector has been one of the worst performing sectors in the market. And that's due to a number of different factors. Stock prices have gone down largely as a result of interest rates, inflation, various global uncertainties, been a number of different shifting market demographics, property type changes as a result of the COVID and post-COVID worlds. And so as a result of these factors, the stock prices have gone down in many cases much more than private valuations have changed. But this year has really, 2020 was a challenging year for some REITs. This year has been a broader based decrease in market values. And as Lawrence and Patrick said earlier, economic issues are what drive a lot of these campaigns. As a result, between that with the fact we now have the universal proxy, this could result in an increase in activism as well as unsolicited offers. And as an example of these market forces actually at play in stockholder activism campaigns, in 2020 and in 2022 thus far, there have been a total of 40 new activism campaigns targeting publicly traded REITs. Again, these are the ones that are publicly known about. There are likely a number of additional campaigns that aren't reported in these numbers. But of note, there have been 3 that have been publicly disclosed just in the last couple of weeks, which we'll talk about here in a few more minutes. On the next slide, we got quite a bit of data on campaigns in the REIT sector. Again, publicly announced campaigns in the last 3 years. There have been 99, 6 currently ongoing. A little over half of the campaigns, the activist was unsuccessful, and then at about 40%, the activist did have some success. In the past 3 years of those 99 campaigns, 21 went to a proxy contest. 2 of those are ongoing. About a third of these, the activist withdrew. About 20%, the activist was unsuccessful. And then in about 40%, the activist did have some success. So, as Patrick and Lawrence said, you've really got to be prepared for these types of situations and really be engaged and really fight hard in the battle to win, because there are a number of these campaigns where the activism does experience some success. On the next slide, we talk about the 3 most recent activism campaigns in the REIT space. The one that was disclosed late last week with Veris Residential, that was an unsolicited proposal by the Kushner Company to either externally manage Veris or to acquire Veris. And as you can see in the letter by the Kushner companies that they publicly disclosed, they outline their history of outreach with the company and some of the actions, and it'll be curious to see how this progresses. But this is one of the M&A focused campaigns. The next one, the Aimco proxy fight with Land and Buildings, very interesting situation given that it's likely the first universal proxy contested election. It certainly is in the REIT space. Those proxies have been filed in the last week or two. It'll be interesting to see how the votes come in the next few weeks. But this will be an interesting one to watch. And then there was another proxy fight announced earlier this week, or at least the beginning of it, with a stockholder demand letter that was issued publicly.
VERIS is interesting. VERIS used to be Matt Kelly. Matt Kelly had two proxy fights against it, I think in 18 and 19 by Bow Street. Bow Street ended up removing folks with the last name Mack from the board in the first year. In the second year, they settled and got control. They had actually bid for the company too several times. And what's interesting about that campaign is, I mean, how much runway does the new board get to try to operate out of, you know, the complaints they had about previous management? Obviously, in this one, you get 3 years and no more than 3 years. I think the other interesting thing about that one is I haven't studied this, but how does Charlie Kushner's bid of $16 per share compare against Bow Street's previous bids for the company? You know, what was possibly an appropriate premium in Bow Street's mind 3 or 4 years ago, and how does that compare against the premium that's being? Is there intellectual honesty? It's an interesting campaign to watch, to see, you know, the new guard get ousted by an even newer guard, possibly. Eyes peeled on that one.
Yep. On the next slide, I'm not going to go into detail here, but again, this shows some of the demands in the REIT activism campaigns over the last 3 years. You'll note that these campaigns add up to more than what was previously disclosed. That's due to the fact that in a lot of these campaigns, activists will make a number of different demands. They'll ask for board seats. They'll argue that certain corporate governance changes need to be made at the REIT, as well as advocating for a variety of other actions, such as a sale of a business or an increase in dividend levels or a spinoff of certain property types. I'm not sure that you can really draw a trend here, but the thing of note is that all of these have been an issue in the last 3 years, and certainly the numbers for 2022 I expect will increase substantially over the next 2.5 months as stockholders start reaching out to management teams to meet the advance notice bylaw requirements.
Yeah, particularly as stock prices go this way.
And then on the next slide, this is a broad-based overview of defenses that are available to REITs that they can use to rebuff activists. This is, I don't want to walk through any of these in detail, but as Patrick's going to next discuss, REITs really need to understand their current defenses available to them, as well as those that they could draw upon in an event that an activist does show up. Again, it's most helpful to make these types of defensive changes when you have a clear sunny day and there isn't an activism campaign that's already been raised. You'll get much more credit for it. You'll have a much stronger defense. But these are the types of issues that boards and management teams really need to get their arms around, both in times of peace, so they're prepared for times of war. It's
a double-edged sword, and I'll hand it over to Patrick. REITs have some of the best defenses to shareholder activism and to control fights in public companies. Most REITs are incorporated in Maryland, which we all know is not Delaware. It literally is not. Maryland literally is not Delaware. If you're keeping score at home. But Maryland is much more board and company friendly than Delaware is. And what this does at the end of the day, strong defenses probably could keep the activists from getting out of the locker room for a period of time. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when the activist is on the field in a proxy fight against a company, you got to win votes to win a proxy fight. And usually these defenses, when you have the mix that a lot of public company REITs incorporated in Maryland have, those attributes will count against them when you're looking to collect votes and convince ISS and Glass Lewis to recommend. So it's very helpful at first blush. But when you think about how these protect over the long term, they do create holes in the armor. So a good story needs to be told about why the defenses are there and what else the company is doing to give back to shareholders in terms of democracy.
And just real quick, one final thought before we move on. This is a topic that we spend a lot of time discussing with the management teams and the board. It's a delicate balance of having a stockholder-friendly form of governance. It's what investors expect, and but you also want to make sure that you do have those defenses still available to you if a situation does occur.
Yeah, a short way of summarizing that. ISS, Glass Lewis, these are generalists. They cover every sector. Probably 90 to 95% of the companies they cover are Delaware companies. So what they're used to seeing are companies whose governance regimes are very similar and are consistent with a more shareholder-friendly Delaware case law regime than Maryland. And so when you compound that with institutions who do all the voting here, the PMs for these large institutions aren't the ones who are actually making voting decisions. It's the governance teams. And those governance teams are also used to covering Delaware companies with almost completely consistent governance regimes. So when you compound both those factors, you can pretty quickly try to project how there will be a reaction to a more Maryland-centric governance regime that may or may not be as shareholder-friendly. So let's talk about response teams. As context for this, the probably most important factor to remember is that the activist does not care if you are prepared, right? It's in their interest for you not to be prepared. So you may or may not get a full heads up that the activist is going live. And if you do get one, as Lawrence and I and Greg can also attest, it may be an hour before the press release is issued, if that, maybe 15 minutes, sometimes after the press release has been issued. And then there are always apologies as to why you were not contacted. So you really cannot afford to be caught flat-footed. If you are in a position where you do understand that your company's performance has not been keeping line or pace with many of your peers, you should already be thinking there might be a shareholder activist that has screened for me, and that may potentially be thinking about running a campaign or at least agitating for change. So I need to go ahead and get my team together now before the wolf shows up on the doorstep, right? Usually those teams are comprised of your lawyers, folks like us up here, your PR team, your proxy solicitor, and your investment bank. Each of them has similar duties in terms of counsel and strategy, but they also have very separate streams in terms of work product. There are many very specialized boutique investment banks, not just the name brand, sort of, bulge bracket banks that also do a really great job with shareholder activism. So if you are a company whose size and whose market cap and whose wherewithal may not necessarily lend yourself to affording, a Goldman or a JP Morgan. There are also more unique, smaller, specialized investment banks and PR firms that do an excellent job. But what's most important is that you retain them, or at least have conversations so that you have your folks lined up before you're actually under threat. Because the last thing you want is to see a press release or a 13D and then be scrambling to respond. Meanwhile, the activist is already at that point trying to reach out to your shareholder group, and he can speak pretty frankly because he has a public disclosure already out there. So as long as he stays within the confines of the four quarters of his releases or his disclosure statements, then he can have a pretty robust conversation. You don't want to be in that position. So to the extent you can, when there's a clear day and you aren't actually in a live fight, put your team together or have some conversations with folks who can assist you if things go live.
And I would just add to that it's not just management that doesn't want to be caught flat-footed. Management doesn't want to hear from a board, why were we caught flat-footed? Usually board members, when a company is caught flat-footed, will reach out to management and say, why are we prepared? Why are we reading about this in the paper for the first time? So like Patrick said, get that team in advance and be prepared to mobilize.
So we've talked about a lot of this. So I'll try to cover what we haven't spoken about. In terms of your relative performance, again, what's most important is the peer group you select. We've seen ISS be highly critical of what they've called, what was the phrasing, Lawrence? For
intellectual
dishonesty and the selection of peer groups by both activists and companies. Not only are you going to have to be very, very intellectually honest with respect to the peer group itself, but the time period over which you are measuring your performance. Last proxy season, ISS was critical of a company for cutting off 2 trading days in a 1, 3, 5-year valuation. Because from ISS's perspective, those trading days would have significantly impacted the projected and measured performance of those companies. So what you really are looking to do here is give yourself the worst possible scenario and then give yourself a best possible scenario in terms of picking your peers and your measurement evaluation periods, and then giving yourself a conservative estimate based on those 2 respective buckets as you blend them together and assess your performance.
What about the one where a company compared themselves to peers that had gone bankrupt during the 1, 3, and 5 year?
And ISS came out and said, you can't use bankrupt companies as part of your evaluation.
You can't average down and make your TSR go up on a relative basis by using bankrupt companies.
Right. And ISS and Glass Lewis aren't concerned so much with the size of the peers, although they want to see you use peers that are approximately your size. They are probably more concerned with the direct competitive nature of the relationship of you vis-a-vis your peers, and they'll use blended revenue groups. They'll do a whole lot of projections internally themselves to make sure that you're being honest about your peer group.
If you make chicken nuggets only, and there are other folks that make chicken nuggets and meatballs, and you compete with them, you could also compare yourself to McDonald's and Burger King. They make chicken nuggets too. I know they do because I try them. But compare yourself to your biggest and baddest peer, the best performing peer, and see how you stack up.
Yeah, and in particular, what we've seen in the REIT space, generally speaking, there is a lot of sensitivity around KPIs. So in particular, in the REIT space, we've seen ISS Glass Solutions and institutions focus a lot on AFFO and FFO. Right? That's always been a hallmark of all the recommendations when determining their analyses in terms of operational performance. Corporate governance, we've spoken about, long-term directors. In terms of long-term, what we mean by that is the benchmark used by ISS Glass Lewis and institutions of 9 years or longer. Any longer than that, the proxy advisors and your respective institutions based on a review of their policies, consider the director's independence to be questionable. And at that point, that director becomes increasingly sensitive to potential proxy agitation removal.
On independence, this is also unique to REITs. There are a number of REITs that are externally managed, and there can be folks from the external manager on the REIT board. There can be REITs that are internally managed that have sometimes a few people with the same last name on the board, who can all be technically independent for exchange purposes and SEC purposes. But if the company's going through a major strategic transaction and you need a shareholder vote, ISS and Glass Lewis will be very focused on how much value the board was able to create, and will also focus not just on the rules for independence, but optical independence. And a lot of REITs that had started off as family businesses or maybe limited partnerships that went public, they have some of those independence issues that they need to figure out how to deal with in the beginning of a transaction or the beginning of a fight, as opposed to 3 days before you meet with ISS and Glass Lewis or before you put your proxy statement out.
Last thing to touch on this slide, shareholder base. Most important aspect of that nugget is you want to know your shareholders, and not just by name. You want to know them by face. You want to be able to have a good well of goodwill built up so that if you're actually in a fight, even if there's been performance trouble in the past, shareholders will give you the benefit of the doubt, even if that just means one more year of stable management before shareholders are willing to hand any of the keys over to any activist nominees. Go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay, and we're a little bit short. First of all, are there any questions that we could address before we? Okay, we'll speed through as much as possible. Corporate governance analysis, very important to do as part of advanced prep. We always say this starts the day after your annual meeting every year. Get your ISS and Glass Lewis reports, get your shareholder voting reports, collect all the feedback you got from shareholders as well during your engagement process. Figure out what you want your proxy statement to look like the next year, and think very critically, what are your high-risk governance practices from the standpoint of, will it hurt you in a proxy contest if you have it? Think about how you either phase those down or how you enhance some of the other shareholder-friendly aspects of your governance to give the appearance, at least, that you're making your governance practices more shareholder accessible. Companies that wait to do this until weeks before the proxy statement or weeks before an ISS and Glass Lewis meeting, it's all going to look very reactive, as we discussed earlier. Next slide. Analyze and improve structural defenses. The good news is if Greg Cope has taken you public and you're a REIT in the past, how long have you been practicing for? 8 years?
25 years.
I'm just kidding. 25 years, although he started practicing when he was 8 years old. If Greg has brought you public, you're going to have very little to do to improve your structural defenses. They're going to be very strong, but you should look at them year in, year out. Know what your strongest defenses are. Some of your defenses aren't automatic. You have to trigger them. Just know where all the tools are, so that when you end up in a live situation, you can pivot right away. Let's go to 31. Stock surveillance. Patrick mentioned know your shareholders. Really good way to know your shareholders is work with a terrific proxy solicitor. We're happy to make recommendations. Have them do a stock watch, stock surveillance service for you to see how the trading is going between and among your largest shareholders. If you look at the next slide, the reporting regimes for shareholders are inadequate. Companies at best getting incomplete and old data on shareholder base on approximately a quarterly basis. There are not that many types of shareholders that are required to file more regularly, particularly if you're under 5%. So besides just being in touch with your shareholders during the quarters and confirming how much they own and trying to understand how they view the company and the board, using stock surveillance could help you get an early warning sign of an activist approach. I'm being told we should go to the universal proxy slide. And then if we have time, we'll go back to slide 34. Okay. How much time do we have? History, 3 minutes. Historically, until the end of August this year, the SEC let companies and activists use their own proxy cards, which meant that in a contested election, the company would have a card with their candidates and proposals, and the activist would have a card with their candidates and proposals. Cards would be different colors, and shareholders would have to pick one card over another. No mixing and matching. That's done for most public companies in corporate America as of September of this year. One card with all the candidates on them. Now mixing and matching can occur. What does this mean? Bottom line, probably harder for the activist to get control, but easier for the activist to get, I'll call it super minorities of the board, one-ish, two-ish, 1.5 directors on a what's the harm thesis, there's long tenure and we're trying to fix that and push the company in the right direction. I think there are 3 extremely important aspects to this. Shareholders must solicit and confirm that they can solicit a minimum of 2/3 of the voting power of shares entitled to vote at an annual meeting. That's a pretty significant undertaking, particularly at the larger companies with a lot of retail components. REITs have very significant retail components too, and this could come into play in universal proxy REIT activism. I also think from a disclosure perspective on the next slide, we point out companies will no longer be able to wait until the 23rd hour before they're going to file their definitive proxy statement to list who their final candidates are. 50 calendar days from the 1-year anniversary of the previous meeting is when the company has to lock in their candidates for a particular contested annual meeting now in the universal proxy regime. The activists have 10 days sooner, earlier than that, to pony up their nominees. What that does probably is it will push companies and activists to conduct even more negotiation and try to resolve these things. But that is a bit of a burden for companies, and it does take one of the activism defense techniques away from the company, which is hiding your slate until the very last minute. We have 1 minute. Let's talk about the last advanced preparation slide, which was slide 34. I think we've mentioned a number of these action items on the defense structure. Now that we've reviewed the universal proxy, a lot of companies are updating their bylaws to have provisions about compliance with the universal proxy rules. And they're taking that occasion to revisit the defenses in their bylaws to shareholders nominating directors or making business proposals. We recommend doing that and looking at that, but follow the latest law on this issue. If you're in Delaware, where most REITs aren't, there's a case pending in Delaware right now. If you're in Maryland, probably a good time to think about bolstering your defenses, because the courts in Maryland are just much more generous to boards and management teams than they are in Delaware. The last thing on this list is a boot camp. The 3 of us will be more than happy to sit down with any board and management team to walk through a presentation similar to this. Could be more particularized to a particular company, a particular REIT. But we think it's important for boards and management teams to know the dance steps before they actually end up in the big show. That's all I have. Do you guys have anything else?
No. I guess the one thing I'll point out, if for those who are interested in the CLE credit, there are a lot of details on the requirements that you have to satisfy with the universal proxy rules in the deck. We just didn't have the time to walk through all of them.
You have to win a debate with Patrick to get CLE credit. Thank you.
Thank you.